Please welcome Mr. William Harris, Jr., President of Army Aviation Publications Incorporated and the Executive Director of Army Aviation Association of America, who will kick off our first panel. Thank you, sir.
All right, guys, my first panel, why don't you head on down here? We're gonna have a 1-hour panel. We've got 3 panels coming up total. And then we'll have after this first panel, we'll have a 1-hour lunch break. Have to say it's kind of nostalgic coming back here. Haven't been back in the building in a couple of years, and especially seeing General Gordon Sullivan's name on here. I remember probably over 20 years ago talking in his office about establishing these kind of things in joint cooperation between Quad A and AUSA. So it's great to be back. Thank you again, AUSA, for giving us the opportunity. And as a plug, yes, you do need to belong to AUSA. If you're in aviation, you also need to belong to Quad A. Just as if you're in National Guard, you belong to NAUGUS and Quad A. So with that, my boss, Major General Davis. Walt, you ready? All right, take it away.
Okay, can everybody hear? Oh, we're good, okay. So privileged to be the humble moderator for the first panel. Just so you know, and it is not a big deal. The panel topic changed from the future aircraft technology enhancements, a layered approach to a complex challenge to what we have now, which is, operating basically in the Air-Ground-Littoral in the 2040 timeframe. And that's okay. The bottom line is we're going to talk about what we believe are the right capabilities that we must have as the aviation element that's integrated into the environment that we think we're going to operate in. So great to have the leaders on this panel right now. Major General Gill has had his time, and my guidance to him was he can talk about whatever. I don't tell the branch chief what they're able to talk about for these kind of panels. And then Brigadier General Cain Baker, who's the director of the Future Vertical Lift CFT, and I know he has some great thoughts to add to this. I tried to prompt the two aviation leaders up here, and beside him, Brigadier General Dave Phillips, our program executive officer for aviation, who didn't have kind of the separate time that the other previous leaders did, also to give their kind of a current ops perspective on how they viewed the challenge of what the panel is intended to talk about, which is future capabilities. And then General Thurman, of course, was our Army G3, and then Force-Com commander, and then the SINC in Korea, and of course has been very involved since his retirement with supporting some of our industry leaders in working the most challenging of the Army aviation modernization priorities. I suggested that he talk about whatever he wants to talk about as well, but really kind of his perspective on whether we think we have the prioritization of the Army aviation capabilities about right, where he perhaps sees some gaps in that, and then also a bit about resourcing of those capabilities and the challenges associated with that. And then finally, Colonel Retired Tom von Eschenbach. You all may remember he served 2 of our great branch chiefs as the director for the Capabilities Development and Integration Directorate at then Fort Rucker, now Fort Novosel. So vast experience there, several years as the director working the capabilities piece, and now a couple turns with industry, where he is currently the senior vice president at Parry Labs for their air and space, as well as the senior site manager for Parry in Huntsville. And I know he sent us a missive this weekend to the people right here on the panel, and I'm going, daggone, I can wind him up and he can talk to you all day about his thoughts with respect to everything from MOSA to ecosystems to integration. But anyway, so with that, they're going to each in turn speak about what I just asked them to consider speaking about. The value, though, is just like with General Menges, is the questions coming from you all to them on specifically things that are on your mind. And so I don't have any, I mean, I can ask them questions. What's important is for you all, after they've had their time, to propose questions that you want to hear more about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to General Gill now to speak about whatever you want.
Thanks, General Davis. Okay, so I think this is your opportunity really to hear about what, he just said gaps, I would say challenges, things that we're thinking about, the unsolved problems that we need to address as a branch. And when I say we need to address it as a branch, what I mean is for the Army, right? So I always caveat everything that we do is just to enhance all the things that we talked about in terms of a combined arms fight. And so I think there's a number of things that we've got going on that are to the Vice's point about transforming in contact that we're doing right now, right? So we've got our current fleet of aircraft that are operating at a breakneck pace. You heard General Brayman talk about that a little bit in terms of tempo and commitments. So we've got to leverage that current fleet, but we're also thinking forward a little bit. And so we talked a lot about unmanned systems. I think that's something that we've got probably a real good panel of folks up here that can speak to that. And launched effects, I'm sure General Baker here is going to talk to that a little bit. As I think about a couple things, I know one term that we're going to use, and General Davis mentioned this, is this ecosystem, right? So this idea that we operate in this environment with manned and unmanned systems, human-machine interfacing, and I talked about the open approach. So this idea that when aircraft are out there, whether they're manned or unmanned, they're doing multiple things, they're sensing things, they're communicating, they're relaying, and they're providing effects on the battlefield. So I think we'll probably talk a little bit about the ecosystem a fair amount. I appreciate that last question about the acquisition process. So I think, that is a huge gap, and this is not an Army aviation thing, but we're here, and so I'm going to use this forum to foot stomp this one a little bit. But at the pace of change of technology right now, we can't operate on budgets that, buy programs of record that take 10 years to field, right? We're a big force. We're not, we're not SOCOM where we buy something and then, in turn, field it to the folks that need it and then trash it and do something else. Like, we buy big systems, we field it to a big fleet, right? So we've got, in fact, I think we've got, I don't know how many versions of Apache out there, probably 4 or 5 versions of Apache flying right now. That's just the way we operate, but that's okay, right? We need to be able to take the technology as it emerges and adapt. And so our acquisition process has to follow that, right? So we've got to have that flexible funding that the Vice talked about. And I think, I know they're carrying the mail with the Congress on that one. I talked about the open system approach. I think, that one just needs to be kind of the beginning of every conversation that we have with industry. That allows us to have that adaptable, if we get the adaptive funding and we don't have a MOSA approach, then we're going to be able to buy things, but we're not going to be able to integrate it. And so I think as we think through, how do we field new systems, this is going to help us with a little bit of cost savings, cost avoidance. I think the one thing for me, maybe in the short time that I've been back in Army aviation, that I think about that concerns me is our airspace management, right? It's not one of the sexy helicopters there. It's not, it's not a big sort of production system. We're not, buying multi-year contracts on airspace. But if you think about that OV1 that I threw up and that the Vice threw up, and you think about the airspace that's going to have, we're going to be putting things in the air from the platoon all the way up to the division level, right? And those systems are not all necessarily going to be, they're not going to know what other things are happening, right? They might be operating as a mesh network, but I imagine the PFC, the platoon that launches something, is not going to necessarily know what brigade's doing a couple miles in front of him and what division's doing a little further from that. And as I think about, putting manned systems in that airspace, we've got a real challenge. The Vice talked about all of our systems, TAEUS, AMDUS, AFATADS. None of those right now are going to be able to manage all of that together and the manned assets that are flying through it. And so I think, we need to think about both procedural mitigations as well as technological mitigations. And so, like I said, if you were to ask me what's my biggest concern, I feel like the branch is in a great shape. I feel like some of our major acquisition systems are in a great shape. I think all the stuff that Cain's team's doing with the CFT in terms of emergent technology, building requirements, we're in great shape. The one thing that concerns me the most is what we're doing about our airspace to be able to operate as a part of that team that I talked about in that ecosystem. So with that, I'll turn over to Cain.
Hey, thanks, sir, and appreciate everybody coming up here today, and it's good to sit up here with this panel. Even Tom down there, another Auburn grad, had a good weekend. But I did read your email, and it took the whole Auburn game to read it, so I'll leave it at that. Hey, three things I'll just discuss here in the beginning. One is how we're really working requirements from a standpoint of the CFT, along with my other CFT brethren and the CDIDs and AFC. David and I were actually at the forefront of what the Vice just talked about with AROCs and how AROCs are going. We were the first one in the queue for FTUS with the chief, and that followed launched effects. And just like the Vice said, we're looking for adaptable requirements so that we actually fill something that we can upgrade and modify over time. We're not just delivering one requirement document and walking away after 20 years. So David and I were at the front of that line at the beginning of the chief's turn here. From a requirement standpoint, FVL still has FLORA, Future Tactical US, LE, MOSA, SEI, et cetera. But what we're doing to those requirement documents are making sure they're flexible, agile, and adaptable. And, so what do I mean by that? Well, commanders in the field can't wait for us to field a program that's going to take 4 to 5 years to get to delivery. They need capability now. General Rainey talks about the Army doesn't have a formation that's hid off in the desert somewhere and we're transforming them and then we're going to bring them out. It's the formations like 2101. It's the units like 10th Mountain. It's like 25th ID with Pacific Pathways. Is how do we get them capability now for them to iterate on? How do we give them a min-viable product, let them train on it, deploy with it, and then get the feedback with it? And so that's very critical on how we're working our requirements process right now. And I'll talk a little bit here in a minute of what's the outlook on our requirements. The other thing, giving that equipment to units is important so we get the feedback, but more important is that they're developing tactics, techniques, and procedures to employ that piece of a system downrange. And we see that today with giving them kit, letting them go to like a JRTC down at Johnson, and then actually taking it home, which is a critical part of that. So 2 examples I will talk about, when it comes to requirements. So the first one is launched effects. Launched effects really allow us to be able to sense and strike deep, in pulse operations inside of formations at echelon. And when I mean echelon, I'm talking brigade, division, and above. And we're also talking that battlefield geometry from close, deep, in our kind of our support areas that the Vice talked about. But from launched effects is where we are with the program, working very closely with David's team is we're now developing in the planning phase of a special user demonstration that we will actually take launched effects into a formation, multiple formations over the next really year, and leave it with them. And I'm talking not only the vehicle, the software, the command and control device, and the payloads. So they have it now for an extended period of time so they can have it home station training for individual and for collective. We will take that feedback and we'll drive the program from there on what we're delivering with launched effects over time across multiple levels. The other one is FTUS. Here's another prime example is how do we look at an agile, flexible process with our requirement document? We spent many years now developing the FTUS requirement that Dave is actually executing that program. Well, one area that we recently got feedback with is up in the 11th Airborne Division is a system that can operate in the Arctic. And so working closely with that division and their requirement that they had approved is now how do we go back to industry and look at, hey, how can we manage a cold winter platform that can operate down to -40 at surface? And oh, by the way, every time you climb 1,000 feet, you gain another, you actually lose another 2 degrees in temperature. And how do we harden that? It's not a complete rewrite of the document at all, but it's a partnership with acquisition. It's a request for information that we send out that we inform that requirement with that capability. at the bedrock of all that is what General Gill said is MOSA. If you're going to have a flexible, agile process, you got to make sure MOSA is applied so we can actually iterate on these systems. And so MOSA continues to be the bedrock across all our requirement documents. And then lastly, and then I'll get off the stage here and hand it over to David, this air-ground-littoral discussion. As the Army warfighting concept gets laid out from AFC, you'll see the air-ground-littoral discussion. And really, we're talking, that near Earth and up to where we operate. And, General Gill said it earlier, hey, we've been operating there for a while. If we flew in Iraq, we flew in Afghanistan, even, prior to that. But what we're really talking about now is for the commander really to expand their maneuver options, have asymmetrical fires, cross-fire capabilities. That is very complicated. That is now when you now begin looking at, as we call the systems of systems that are going to operate in this space. You can call it an ecosystem, you can call it system of systems, but now we're talking the platforms, we're talking the effects, and then we're also talking all the host of equipment from mission command systems across the warfighting functions. So how do you integrate that inside of this thing that we call air-ground-littoral? And then how do you have it have the interdependencies are fully connected? Especially in a data-centric layered network where you've got to be able to pass information very quickly so a commander can make a decision and then be able to quickly strike on a target to affect the battlefield. And so, as we go through the panel, I'll be more than glad to talk about how we're viewing this from not only just an FVL's perspective, but across the Army enterprise. I mean, if you look at launch effects, it's the most cross-cutting capability that we have because it touches almost every warfighting function. And so I'll hold off there and I'll hand it over to my battle buddy who I work with on a daily basis. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, several times a day. So good morning, everyone. Great to see everybody. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge a lot of the mentors and friends out in the audience today, a lot of folks that we have a chance to talk with at all these different engagements, but this is a great opportunity to really hear kind of how we're harmonizing together. And I think that was my takeaway from the first couple briefs is that a lot of the things that we're doing that used to be traditionally maybe a PEO thing, and MOSA when it started out was kind of grown out of some great work that was in the S&T community, and then it transitioned into some of the acquisition community. That is now across our branch, right? And we're leading that for the Army. So it's great to hear some of that harmonization across our pitches this morning. But what I'd like to start with is a few things that have changed, a few things that haven't changed, and kind of our different ways of doing business and the things we double down on. So I'll start with, like General Gill said this morning, the things that have changed, right? Back on the 8th of February, everyone's paid attention, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of go back and revisit some of the things that did change and some of the things that didn't. The FAR program ended development, and that was going to end with this year's funding. But that being said, the things that did not end out of that development were the open system verification demonstrations, the ground runs of the ITEP engine, which we've had 3 of those now down at West Palm Beach and the FAR competitive prototypes, and also the modular effects launcher work, right? Those pieces of that development were so important that we went ahead and resourced those throughout this year to make sure we could transition them into our other programs going forward, and specifically Black Hawk, Apache, FLRAA moving forward in those capabilities. The 60 Victor program, another program that we ended. However, we're going to continue to build out the aircraft. We're up at about 70 aircraft now. We're going to get to just over 100 that we're going to build out with this year's funding. And then the other big piece there that transitioned again was the open system approach and how to communicate with industry, how to build it into a model-based systems engineering approach, and how to genuinely understand how we'll have an architecture that is transferable, not just from that platform, but out into our enduring fleet platforms, and with FLRAA leading the way from a clean sheet design perspective. MOSA's in our DNA really, and it's here to stay. With ITEP, we delayed the production there. So we're delaying production, but that has not ended the integration of the ITEP and the Black Hawk. We've got 2 engines down in West Palm Beach today. Those engines are getting integrated into the first test aircraft. We think here in 2025, fiscal year 2025, we'll see absolutely those engines running in the Black Hawk, and we'll see some flight tests executed because we're getting a lot of great results out of the rest of the flight, the pre-flight tests that we're doing on the engine stands with the ITEP engine. John Robinson mentioned the front frame being 1 part versus 200. It's a huge opportunity from a sustainment perspective, a fuel efficiency perspective, and really it's the next generation engine of the future. When you have 3,000 horsepower versus 2,000, that's a significant change for our platforms when you multiply that by 2 especially. What also changed in our UAS fleet, obviously we're divesting the Shadows and the Ravens. We are investing, like we said, in all those other components, FTUAS, like General Baker said, launch effects, short range, medium range, long range. And then really from the Black Hawk perspective, we're finishing out our multi-year 10 discussions, and that's been very productive because we were able to look at opportunities with a very top level. We're going to build, we had intended to build 255 aircraft. We're adding another 17 aircraft to that contract. That's going to be a great opportunity to kind of bridge to the multi-year 11 contract that we intend to award in early 2027. So the early fiscal year 27, we'll have the resources there. And we'll be investing in another multi-year contract for Black Hawk and really investing in those capabilities. ITEP, open systems, launched effects, all coming in from things we've learned from the FARA program, the FLRAA program, and from the 60 Victor program. Chinook Block 2, as General Gill said, we're moving out there with that capability. We're producing those. We got the first 5 in production. We've taken delivery of 1, probably the second this week. We had a bird strike earlier in the week during acceptance flight, so no major damage, just enough to go back and do a little after action check out on the aircraft. FLRAA absolutely made its way through milestone B. That's huge for the Army because that's every component of the Army buying in on where we're at. It's everyone from the G4 to the CIO and all the way making that recommendation back to Mr. Bush to determine, are we ready for the next phase of development? And we are. We're moving forward with the MD program, and with that, it'll be building aircraft here in the next couple of years. And then finally, back to UAS, we're investing there across the spectrum, whether it's small UAS from the short range, medium range, and long range smalls, the future tactical UAS, which is really that Group 3 size, launch effects, and then Gray Eagle. We're investing across that portfolio and making some great strides ahead with common architectures. I won't get into a lot of the other details because I think I'm eating up General Thurman's time, so I won't do that much more. But what I'll say is what hasn't changed, the teamwork that you see across the aviation guys, right? We have doubled down on that teamwork. You can hear it with General Baker and my comments. We work together every single day. Our teams are working at echelon together to be able to refine requirements, get industry feedback, come back with better opportunities to bring on new technologies, new actual, not just payloads, potentially air vehicles downstream. And so we're really doing that on a daily basis. We're continuing to double down on our work with partners and allies. One of the largest foreign military sales portfolios in the Army is MPO Aviation. You probably saw recently the 96 Apaches for Poland and the 60 Chinooks for the Germans last year. And of course, the Australians are great partners. They were just visiting with us last week. And that doesn't include all the other great partners that we have out there. And then finally, I would just say that, we're also paying attention to that strategic environment. And I'll say this, you cannot not pay attention to the supply chain. You can't not pay attention to cybersecurity. You absolutely have to pay attention to those, whether it's a new start program or an enduring fleet program, because they are pivotal in the foundation of building these new machines. And that's why we've invested time and energy with industry to better understand that and to better buy down that risk together. And so I'll pause there and hand it over to you, sir, and appreciate the opportunity.
Well, first off, hit the mic button here. It's great that you would ask an old soldier here to come and sit on this panel with all these smart guys here. As I think about what's going on in today's environment, we cannot complicate the battlefield, okay? We're adding some new capabilities out there. What you got going on is time and space requirements are different. Okay, and I'm talking all the way from that squad all the way to a corps commander. And so we need to think about it in those terms. How can we provide the best Army aviation support to the ground commander? That's who we work for. and we're part of combined arms maneuver. And we can never forget that. So Joel Davis asked me to talk about some of the capability gaps. And the first one I'm going to tee up is about the cancellation of FARA. We still have a reconnaissance gap for the tactical commander out there. It's there. We took the future attack reconnaissance aircraft and I understand how decisions are made in the Pentagon, you know, especially when you have resource issues. And that's always been there. So the decision was made to terminate that program and start taking in more of the lessons from what's going on in the current environment in Ukraine and Israel. So we were looking at the proliferation of a lot of unmanned systems, not only air, but ground and sea. So the real question is how do you integrate that inside of Army aviation for manned and unmanned assets? Look, I want a manned person on the battlefield. I was a division cavalry squadron commander. I worked directly for a division commander. And I think you're going to still need a human in the loop on the battlefield. You're not going to be able to always rely completely on unmanned systems. So it needs to be fully integrated with manned and unmanned systems. And oh, by the way, you got to be able to communicate. The first question I always asked as a division commander is, how are we going to communicate? And that's really important in combat when you break contact with the enemy with an unmanned system. And so this network business, I think, is the number one gap also that we have across the Army, and the chief is focused on that. So we've got to be able to bring that on board as soon as we can. And we got to practice. You got to go. I'm very happy to see what was done at Fort Johnson with the 101st. The more you can do things like that and exercise these new capabilities and how we're going to fight, the better we are. Because if you don't train it, you don't let the soldiers at the lowest level figure out, hey, this works better this way, and work out tactics, techniques, and procedures, then we're going to be behind. We do not have the luxury to sit back and get into the next fight and decide how we want to operate. We got to do that now. I was in on one of those deals over there, and that was 1003 Victor for the attack into Iraq. Okay, I was the C3 for that operation, and we're fielding equipment at the last minute. So let me get back to the reconnaissance business here. One, it needs to be manned and unmanned. Army aviation, I believe, can survive in the current environment. We've got to figure out the battle space management. We got to figure out, obviously, the threats and how we're going to deal with counter UAS out there and all the systems that affect aviation. But it gives you more flexibility and agility out there on the battlefield if you got a manned asset. See, I want a person out there that is looking through his own eyeballs, that can sense, can see what's happening and pass information in a timely manner. There's a difference in surveillance and reconnaissance. The way I divide that up, surveillance is where you've got a long-term target that you want to continue to stay on for an inordinate amount of time. I think unmanned systems work great on that. Reconnaissance is something that's got to be quick, that tells the division or corps commander what they see, what is going on, and what's happening. And so I think we can work through all that. But we can't forget about the fundamentals and our doctrine that's been developed over history. That stuff still works. You're just a little more complicated. And so don't get discouraged about that. So when the Army canceled FARA, The other thing that happened was inside a force structure. We took down the light cavalry formations in the light divisions, the brigades and light divisions. We took all the cavalry out of there. Well, who's going to do the reconnaissance mission? How are we going to fill that gap? I know we're going to talk cross attach, task organize, do all that. We left a gap there. And we got to own up to that on how we're going to fill that gap. And I'm sure the Army's going to work its way through that, but that's something that we can't forget. And the force structure, I understand why force structure was taken out. Given, the size of the Army, because it's gotten smaller. So we can work through these things, and you got to practice and you got to train it and you got to go out and experiment with this stuff and make it worthwhile for the ground commanders. I think aviation needs to spend more time with the ground commanders and talking about what capabilities you need and why you need these assets and how it will make his job better. I really believe we need to spend more time on that. And the more you can get in the dirt and practice this stuff, the better it is. So I'm happy with what I'm seeing with discussing this Air-Ground-Littoral. When you get into that and you read that concept, that's something that I think is going to be worthwhile for the future. Again, it's about time and space, and dimensions have changed. When you look at weapon systems that can fire 2,000 kilometers, well, somebody's got to coordinate somebody's battle space you're shooting into. And so how's that going to work? I think it's got to be worked out. The other thing that I'd talk about here would be on launched effects. I think very good work that the Army's doing on launched effects and what you can do with those systems, whether it be air or ground systems. I think very good work on that by the Army. The last thing I would say is don't overcomplicate the situation that we have. We can get through that. Aviation's got to be part of the overall concept of maneuver, and it needs to be planned in conjunction with the ground commanders when that's done. I don't think we need a drone branch, okay? If it flies, it belongs to Army Aviation. We've got a drone branch. It's Army Aviation. That's what General Gill does. And this great team of aviators up here. So I would, I'd go on record on that, but my pacemaker come unglued when I saw this drone branch. I'm saying, what in the world are we creating that for? That's more force structure. It's just a second, third order effects to that. We got what we need to do, and we know what we need to do today, and I just encourage you to do it, and I'm confident this crowd here is going to make this happen. Thank you.
So I'm just humbled and honored to be here in front of really what the who's who of Army Aviation, and it's a little unnerving as I look at Lieutenant General Francis, who trained me to be an SGL. He's going to give me my final grade. Mark Hayes said he would disown me if I failed up here, and I think I've counted at least 5 general officers in the crowd that were students when I was an SGL. So it's great to see everyone. Maybe I'll lead off, and one of the titles that I saw that flashed up for this panel was the Air-Ground-Littoral of 2040. And I thought about 2040. I'll be 72 in 2040. And I know I'm not the oldest person in this room, right? That's kind of sobering to think out that far. But if you take it and back it up and think 15 years ago, which was 2010, I was an aviation task force commander in Jalalabad, and it seems like that was a blink of an eye. That wasn't too long ago. It's human nature, I think, to over plan what we can do in 1 to 2 to 3 years and forget what we should be doing in 10 to 15 years. And that requires, I would say, a little bit of patience, perseverance, a strategy to be, to not make those changes, year to year. I think that's certainly how we have to think about fielding capability over time. And my last kind of point, and I'll make a compelling comment here about capability. General Lundy and General Gaylor taught me that technology does not equal capability. Capability is when you can integrate it, train it, and deploy it at scale, which is why in the seated, there is OPFD, which is the Force Development Directorate and proponent for force. I mean, capability means that a soldier has to have it in their hands in the formations, deployed at scale so that we can have tactical and operational overmatch. This panel is about the tactical ecosystem, but as the industry rep here for the panel, I will tell you, we need to have a matching acquisition ecosystem to field that tactical one. And when you think about an ecosystem, it's when all organisms are being symbiotic or have synergies and operate with each other. They don't eat each other, they operate together. And as we think about open systems, and the M is modularity, where you can now sever modules at a smaller level, the amount of industry partners that participate in that ecosystem, I think, has grown, which is a challenge. And how to do that through contracting, management, and then testing at the smaller, more granular level, I think is also a challenge. So I'll hand it back over to the panel for questions.
So first, thank everybody for all of these. I don't think we're going to get to all this first, but I think someone had a question from the audience. Says, use the mic whenever you feel is appropriate. Now is the appropriate time. And we have a partner talking to us. That's
Yes, hello. I'm Colonel Peter Nieuwenhuis from the Dutch Embassy, the Netherlands Military Attaché. Thank you for organizing this great event. And my question is, we don't hear much about vulnerabilities and challenges based on the current characters of war, especially for aviation, like 24/7 visibility, no air superiority or very hard to achieve, sensors in space and cyber. So how do you address these vulnerabilities in future capabilities, future operations, and future TTPs? Can you elaborate on that, please?
So, one, thanks for the question and attending. So, when you talk through the vulnerabilities, so I'll kind of answer this in two parts. A lot of what we do on the requirement side is actually fed through what we call high fidelity modeling, where we take adversaries' capabilities, we place it into a top secret classified modeling simulation that actually General Phillips and I work together, and we run these models on the capabilities from a standpoint of actual operational mission sets. And so that's very important that we see that, and we do it across multiple spectrums. It's just not a threat idea of a weapons engagement range, but it's, how are they able to enter the network? How are they able to manage the affect the data? And so that itself has been very fruitful when we just for example, with our launched effects and what we're doing, that really drives our requirements and how we set the requirements for what we want the acquisition to go out and purchase and how we field it. And then from another standpoint of vulnerabilities, I link that back over to our experimentation. And so Future Vertical Lift, we're getting ready to begin our experimentation exercise actually next week out west in the desert. That experimentation really started, 4 years ago, and we've advanced it forward. But this year alone, it's really a two-part experimentation. Is that, we wanted to look at waveform characterization, that we put it in contested environment against real live emitters, against that we see with our adversaries, and we looked at how those waveforms behave or actually are protected. And then now as we move forward out to the desert, this Future Vertical at this Edge event this year is really focused on how we look at autonomy and behaviors inside of really an echelon approach as we would see our ground forces fight against. So it's back to General Thurman's point. It's really focused on what does the ground commander have to plan for and actually execute. So we've got a scenario where we're deploying surrogates with our launched effects on UASs. We're really asked industry to come out and look at, hey, show us those behaviors on how they would operate. But it's not just in a pristine environment. It's against an actual threat with emitters that we take the feedback from, and we get a good understanding of how we are survivable, how do we protect ourselves better inside of the environment. So just to wrap that up, we do it inside of our modeling and simulation. We put it out against an actual experiment against those things, and then we take it even forward from there as we field it with units as they go through live training events at the collective level. So hopefully that answered your question, sir.
Okay, so from the audience and for General Phillips and General Baker and perhaps a branch chief, requirements processes and procurement processes, what changes that have occurred in the past 3, 4, 5 years have worked the best, and what changes do you still see that may need some adjustment? And then is there anything industry can do to help with perhaps working through some of that? So for either of you that want to talk that.
So I'd be happy to jump in there, sir. I think from a very macro level, the Army and the DoD have been trying to reform acquisition probably since 1972 or 3, when they first had a system that really wasn't as responsive as it needed to be then. But what I'd say today, what are we doing things differently? And General Baker talked about some of the things we walked through with the Future Tactical UAS and Launched Effects AROCs. And we really stopped and thought about it carefully about the things we're doing differently, right? Because there's a business approach, there's an acquisition approach, and there's a technical approach. And so with that business approach, instead of a very linear process, we've absolutely gone to a more iterative process. And that business approach being using new authorities, right? So how are we changing acquisition? We're absolutely embracing other transaction authority agreements. We're embracing the new types of acquisition authorities that Congress gave us back in 2016 and 17, middle tier acquisition for rapid prototyping, middle tier acquisition for rapid fielding, urgent capability acquisition. We've been given some new authorities, and we are absolutely embracing them across our portfolio. I could list off so many programs we've got now in PO Aviation that have embraced these different types of authorities, whereas 5 years ago they were nascent. And really, I don't think we in the PEO and maybe in our acquisition professionals understood how to execute them as well as they should and be more agile with our requirements teammates. But I would say we've got sets and reps now under our belt. We've got iterative chances to do design work for FLRAA. We had iterative chances to look at with launched effects and Future Tactical UAS. And those iterative processes are going to carry on into the future as we feel tranches of capability. From an acquisition perspective, I believe we're all in. And then the underpinning of that is our open system approach and the strategy there. It's a technical approach, and it sounds very technical, but it's no different than having a defined set of standards and interfaces for software and hardware for your iPhone or your Android. If it was all unique per phone like it was 20 years ago, we would never be able to upgrade to stay ahead of the threats and to really stay at the pace of technology. So with that, I believe it wouldn't be possible if both the acquisition community and the requirements community didn't embrace the new way of doing business. So General Baker, I'll turn it over to you and see if you have any thoughts, or General Gill.
I just want to jump in on this because I got asked a similar question, different way, a couple of weeks ago. Small business said, hey, we can't compete because we can't kind of carry the money over year if we don't know if you're going to have a predictable budget, right? So this is where you can help us, right? I mean, this has been a drumbeat for every Army senior leader that I've seen since I've been in the Army, but the continuous, the CRs, the continuing resolutions year over year make it really hard for folks to cash flow if we can't tell them that we're going to, we're not sure what's going to happen. We're not sure if that contract's actually going to get let till April of next year. And so I think that, I know the bigs, the primes do pretty well because they understand the system and they probably have the cash to be able to sort of weather that. But for the small business out there, my sense is that's pretty disruptive to your ability to compete and, win awards.
Okay, this is for General Baker and perhaps others as well. But aviation platforms are expected to generate increasing amounts of data going forward. What is being shared with the network, cross-functional team, and PEO or EIS to prepare for handling moving large amounts of data in tactical and garrison environments?
Yeah, so great question. I kind of alluded to it earlier. So inside the Air-Ground-Littoral, you're going to have platforms moving that are either one consuming information or they're producing information. To be able to provide that back to a broader community, really our leaders on the ground, so they can make quick decisions and affect the enemy. And so, the C2 fix piece, their first portion you heard the chief talked about. David and I worked together with our teams from a standpoint of what happened down at JRTC with 2101. We talked about embedding, it was really Agner radio that with David's team and my team placed on both the Chinooks and the Blackhawks and some federated on the Apaches, and then along with base stations along the route. So they could have both data and voice from Fort Campbell down to Fort Johnson. So the commander could have 100%, well, not 100%, but could have situational awareness at the brigade and division level as they begin doing that joint forcible entry. The other piece that we work there is we know that we have to extend the network. We know that we have to thicken the network inside of this fix regime. And so one area that we've now shown a lot of capability, we call the aerial tier network extension, where we've got a solar power vehicle at altitude that can fly up to 72 hours and longer, that allows us to really thicken the TSM network. That has produced a ton of capability for both ground commanders, if we've seen them now at the National Training Center and down at the Joint Readiness Training Center, and we actually put it over in the Pacific last year. So that is a close relationship inside the fixed piece. The C2 next aspect, really back to next generation C2 with the office that's been stood up at AFC, is us working closely with them so we understand how we're going to offboard the data inside of this layered data network when C2 Next comes on. That is one area that we've got a lot of work to do because it's really agnostic of how that looks. And so if you look at, so for example, LE operating out at the tactical edge, and we're talking maybe 400 to 500 kilometers, and whatever mission that it is on, what data requirements do you need to push back? Is it a chip out coming off of that LE? Is it a data burst? Or is it a continuous streaming of information? So all that goes into how we look at the network and what we really need to put on for these platforms. And so it's a fine balance as we work inside the fix, as we move towards the next. And then, I think the last point that I'll just emphasize is what the vice said. We have been late to the game, I think, on aviation platforms to be able to communicate with the ground forces. You see what we're doing with ITN and TSM. We've got to stay on top of that as an aviation force. And that, we talk the Air-Ground-Littoral, the systems to systems, that's a critical component, is that we never can get in the position where we can't talk to the ground commander. And I think we've kind of had that happen here inside the fix, and we're quickly adapting to it with Agner, but we can't let that happen for the future. So thanks.
So this one will get General Thurman fired up again on this whole drone corps thing, but I mean, it's sort of related to that. But anyway, the question is that the other three services, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, are working loyal wingman concepts as well as collaborative combat aircraft. And is there any move for us, the Army, to kind of go in that direction? Or, I think I know what the answer is going to be on this, but are there any plans to introduce that kind of concept within Army aviation?
Go ahead, sir. Take a crack at it.
Yeah, well, I think when you look at where we want to go in 2040, I've seen that concept. General Rainey asked me to come down and several of us and looked at that. we've got a good concept for the future. I think what we've got to do, number one, and I've looked at what the Air Force and the Navy want to do. I think we need to go to them and say, this is how we intend to fight in the ground domain with our assets. And this is what we're going to need in terms of battle space management, looking across all domains that we are going to fight in. So I would say, I wouldn't recommend that right now. I think we've got to stay the course with what we're doing. We got to feel things faster. And I use the ITEP engine. I was the G3 of the Army in 2007, and it is what, 2024 now, Dave?
Yes, sir. It is.
And we're still sitting here. So, and I know what happens to programs with funding and all that. But I think given the resources that we have, we can't afford to be switching back and forth right now. We've got to stay the course with what we have and continue to work and iterate with the other services. I think Project Convergence, Project Edge gives you a great opportunity to work with these other services. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, sir. So are we doing a wingman concept? No, but launched effects effectively is that, right? It's the wingman that actually goes out in front. I think General Rainey likes to say the first thing that's going to make contact with the enemy is going to be a machine. First thing that's going to see something is going to be a machine. First thing we're going to put in a dangerous situation like a minefield is going to be a machine. So rather than, and this kind of gets the kind of doctrinally how we operate, right? I mean, if you think about Air Force and Navy, loyal wingman, like, they need somebody to bring more bombs with them or, more air to ground munitions. What we need is things to go out and sense and report back so that we can put the decisive capability where we need it to be. So are we thinking about loyal wingman? No, but I think the man-to-unmanned teaming aspect of what we're doing is, probably right in that wheelhouse. And, I get asked all the time, what's the ratio? I don't know. I mean, I think the ratio is sort of Met TC dependent, right? So there may be certain functions that we can put a machine on, but as General Thurman said, if you're on the ground, you want a man in the loop somewhere, right? You want somebody that you're talking to, not somebody back in Nevada, necessarily. So I think there's a ratio there. When we think like deep strike first things, we might want to put a machine out there early when we have sort of degraded the environment to the conditions that the ground commander wants, then we might introduce some manned assets. So I think it's, like all great answers, and it's depends answer.
And General Phillips, I think this may be for you based on on the acquisition experience. I don't know if this question is from Dr. Lewis or not. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. But it talks airworthiness, release, and certification processes. Currently don't support transformation and contact because of the time it takes. Are we doing anything to look at those processes to help speed it up? So,
yeah, I think that's a great question. And our teammates in the DEVCOM, CCDC, and really in AVMIC that are SRD, the Systems Readiness Directorate, have made great strides, I would say, over the past several years at really adapting to the new ways of doing business. And I can look at a couple very specific examples coming out, again, things we got out of the FAR program that are going to be impactful downstream. One of the vendors there was doing a lot of additive manufacturing as well, of rotating components and individual parts that we had not had a good pedigree from an airworthiness perspective in years past. We used that as an opportunity to really get our SRD teammates on board early, and then they came in and certified the process for the design, the build, the manufacturing, the test of that part that was probably a first of a kind for a rotating component. So getting that set and rep under their belt is hugely helpful. And I would say, back to General Baker's comment about our work to get the C2 fixed capability up to the 101st. The folks from SRD called me on a Thursday and said, "Hey, do I need to have people up there this weekend?" All right, the director of SRD said, "I want to know, do I need to have people up there?" I said, so we're going to have folks up, but definitely appreciate the teamwork. And they deployed up there with us, had people on site, making sure that we had the right configurations in the aircraft, because these are roll-on, carry-on kits They were not fully integrated kits that we put in those aircraft. So having that teamwork and having the sets and reps from an additive manufacturing capability and from a no kitting in the field, putting their hands on the machines, I think we're getting there, and we're probably changing underneath the radar. What I would say is what we really need to make sure we're also changing is above the radar with industry. So you see what's going to be required from a qualification and a test perspective downstream. We don't want to be surprising you downstream with some of those things and say, well, we changed this process or we adapted this process or we have a faster process here, without sharing that with y'all in industry and making sure we get that feedback along the way.
Okay, I think this is going to be about, what, 2 minutes and 48, 47. Okay. All right. For General Baker and General Phillips, to define LRPM, kind of what the future for long range precision munitions, and if in fact it's going to actually compete. And there's probably some between launched effects, long range precision munitions, that tension, that's there. So that's the final question.
Yeah, yes, sir. So, this year we updated the launch effect requirement document. We took it from just an air launch platform to a really air and ground where it's agnostic. The one piece that was missing in there was the lethality aspect of, as General Gill briefed earlier this morning, see, sense, and strike. Well, we need to be able to strike with launched effects, and we need to be able to strike for it at ranges. And so, working closely with Missiles in Space, and David, and really through, Honorable Bush and his authorities, is we wrote in LRPM as the lethal variant of launched effects. And the approach that we're pursuing now is, really our first set of launched effects is that we see being launched from air and ground at really a slower speed, because we know where the survivability is for that. And then, the growth of this is, we still need a fast capability to be able to close the distance when we do target something. And so LRPM allows us to get that lethal capability at the tip end of really of all of our launch effects, the short, medium, and long. And so, David, I hand it over to you.
I'll just add briefly that from an acquisition authority's perspective, ASALT leadership has been very supportive of this approach, and moving quicker from a launched effects perspective gives us the chance to seize on high TRL capabilities from not only the air vehicle and the data link and the actual lethality payload, right? So we can put all those together. We can give that truck with the air vehicle that's mature to PO Missiles in Space. They can integrate a warhead into that payload, and then we'll be able to put that together and put it into the field a lot faster probably than we used to do it when we were stovepipe. So we're trying to share each other's expertise in that field. Mr. Bush is very keen on making sure we're not duplicating efforts, whether it's sensors or lethality payloads. And I would say that they're continuing to explore the space of what a faster munition may look like as well there at PO Missiles in Space, to make sure we're coming back and informing acquisition strategies and requirements for future capabilities. So it's that iterative process that I talked about earlier.
So that plus or minus 10 seconds. I mean, that was fantastic.